I've been estranged from that side of the family forever and ever. Amen. And the grandparents are dead, so it's not like anybody's going to hear this. But just for my own good juju, I would rather not be a spiteful, hateful little bitch, you know?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
We actually call our grandmother Nying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I call him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Uchechu means old woman, thinking at Rwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mami Tita.
We called her Mima. Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
So on today's episode, we have Lauren, and she talks about her relationship with her grandmother that was a difficult one and memories that are very conflicted. She had good memories and negative memories, and she talks about how she came to terms with that and in the end comes to focus on the good.
Yeah, it's just not a typical story that we've heard before. The representation of a grandmother that is a juxtaposition in and of herself as well. Like she talks about her grandmother being kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I thought that was really interesting and you know, how that comes across to a child and then to an adult that's looking back. All right, let's hear it.
So why did you want to come on the podcast?
Putting a call out for stories about grandparents that aren't so nice, I imagine would be a bit of a difficult niche to find.
Mm-hmm.
And yes. I thought, you know, I kind of fit that profile. I've got some stories. I can help you out. So I thought it would just maybe be nice to share that side of the story, not only for a healing thing for me, but, you know, to maybe reach out and connect to others in the same boat. Today, we're talking about my paternal grandmother, Evelyn, specifically her. Her husband, Frank, my grandfather, was a very quiet, big teddy bear hillbilly of a man. So Evelyn is more my focus. She was the matriarch of the family.
Okay, and what was she like? What can you tell us about her?
First and foremost, she was an absolute battle axe of a matriarch. You know, not just the stern stay in line, although you sure as hell did with Evelyn. She was definitely more the tough love than the squishy, cuddly baked cookies kind of love. Although she could bake a mean loaf of bread, I must say. She was easy to laugh. I remember more happy memories with laughing and smiles and feel-good moments than I do the bad ones. But the bad ones were pretty jarring. So in all of that, I mean, I'm speaking a touch ill of my experiences because, yeah, some of them were pretty rough, and I didn't really realize until I grew up. But in the vein of speaking about that, she was an incredible mother. She was strong and resilient and tough as hell.
I love how you describe her as a battle axe.
Every truest sense of the word. I mean, she truly was. If there was a picture in the dictionary, Ev's face would be right there. You never, ever towed out of line with Evelyn because you just didn't, because the wrath of Ev, of my grandmother, was unquenchable, truly. And she could be real nasty, like a real Jekyll and Hyde. So Battleax in that sense, her word was law, and you didn't mince words at all. Very tough love, as I mentioned, and nothing was done without her say so or her approval. But you could definitely tell if it was going to be a good day with Evelyn or not the second you walked in that door. And so from one day to the next, you just didn't know. But everybody was so fearful of, you know, stepping outside the lines around her that you just didn't, because I'm sure she could snap, and I'm sure she did. You know, I'm sure she did at point, or something triggered her, but I couldn't pinpoint one.
Mm-hmm. I'm picturing, I guess, like a lot of like you're saying how you could tell when you like entered a room, what kind of interaction it would be or what kind of mood she was in. I picture like tension, and then when she was a good mood, like she was laughing and stuff, that people must have felt so relieved.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's what like colored those interactions as more positive, because you're like, yes, she's in a good mood today.
Absolutely. And especially coming from her with the personality that she had, that really hardened heart kind of a personality. It was almost scary. It was almost shocking when she did laugh or when she did smile or crack a joke, because it seemed like that wasn't a natural thing for her. You know, that she just seemed far more hardened than the humor that she did have and the big toothy grin would allow for. It was almost like you were scared that her face would crack from smiling.
So what was it like experiencing that as a kid?
Well, I'm going to dial it back just a touch because my history with that side of the family is pretty tumultuous. They had 5 children, and their golden child was my father, who at a young age in university, he dropped out. He ended up being addicted to drugs and alcohol, divorcing with my mother when I was about 5, then inevitably committing suicide years down the road, I think in 96, I believe. So this whole sense of all the adult stuff that was really going on kind of spilled out onto the kids, right? Onto my brother and I, first and foremost. So as much as we got lumped in with my mother in the sense that she was maybe blamed for my grandmother's son going off the rails, we were kind of lumped into that because we were the kids and we were part of that family. It was a real tightrope to walk. And as a kid, you still know what's going on. You still feel tension in a room. You still know when, you know, the temperature of a room is not warm and fuzzy. So it was really tough to navigate as a 5-6-year-old kid with my 17-month younger little brother, joint custody weekends and having to do family dinners when we absolutely at that age felt and were made to feel like the outcasts. Like we weren't actually a fully integrated member of the family.
Well, that's too bad, hey, that they that the family really took out adult issues on you guys as kids.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. And it's tough to say why that happened. Now, Evelyn's parents were my maternal grandmother. I spoke with her, Darlene, about Evelyn, just because I was so young. I have no idea about the history of her family. But as it turns out, she was raised by just a pair of nasty humans, right? So she came by that honestly. It was a learned behavior from her to be treated the way that she sometimes treated us, my brother and I. So it's hard to fault her. You know, I don't know that she ever really was taught how to love or received it. She came from really tough, weathered stock, as many of that generation did, right? Homesteading, and you know, you don't have a pot to piss in unless you make it yourself. The work that gets done is done by the sons that you give birth to, because if you don't, then you got to do it all yourself. She could be real nasty. I mean, nasty to the point of when my mother was pregnant with my brother. Keep in mind, we're 17 months apart. So I was young. I was a babe in arms. She came out into the yard to play with me, and Evelyn was out gardening, and she took one look at this poor, tired, pregnant, brand spanking new mother who was 22 years old and went, "You look like you're about to miscarry."
Oh my God.
And not saying, "Geez, you look really tired. Maybe you should go lay down. I'll watch Lauren." So, you know, no, it was nasty. You know, there's no other way to interpret that.
Yeah, it's just hurtful.
Oh, it's cruel.
I bet your mom has some stories, though, hey? Like, that was her mother-in-law, right?
Yeah, I spoke with her as well about that.
So what was it like for her?
It was really tough. I mean, think about it. She's 21, 22. She's got 2 kids, basically. What were we doing at that age? Probably a hell of a lot. Yeah. So.
Oh my God, I know.
So here she is with all these responsibilities. She has a husband, her golden child, that quit going to university and didn't tell his mother because you didn't cross Evelyn. Didn't tell her for like a year. and a half. And then he gets into drugs and alcohol, where before he was an all-star athlete and super smart, excelled academically. So there was a whole bunch of pressure on my mother to fit in and fix this man who she thought she was marrying, who is completely now changed and is causing rifts within his own family, but now she's being sucked in and being blamed. So she had one hell of a time for 5 years before they finally divorced.
Sorry, did you say that it caused rifts, like your father's like alcohol and substance abuse caused rifts within his own family?
Yeah, so his substance abuse, for the most part, was really only known by a couple of his brothers who eventually tried to sit him down and do an intervention. Evelyn knew a little bit, but she wasn't aware of the full broad stroke of how deep he was in that hole. And so the more he is, going out and partying, and there's trouble in Evelyn's son's marriage now. So there was mega rifts in the family, not just because the marriage was failing and it wasn't a perfect picture of what a marriage should be with the white picket fence and kids and a dog. It was also substance abuse and stealing and lying. And I'm sure it was tough for Evelyn to hear anything negative about her son. I know it. I know that was extremely difficult, and that was a trigger for her. I remember a time where he wouldn't pick up the phone, or he had come to pick my brother up and I, and didn't happen like all the other times. And I was leaving my grandparents' house, and I'm sure that my grandmother thought that I was coached or taught to say this, but in that moment, it was such a raw emotional self-awareness and anger in my 5-year-old little self. And I stood up for myself and I said, sarcastically, that's one hell of a son that you've managed to raise, Granny. He's being a shit and I'm hurting. His kids are hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sure that didn't make it any easier on my mother. She remembers that day pretty vividly. So do I.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. That's so sad.
Well, it is sad. I mean, there are sad moments and really, tough moments that I look back now and I go, God, today, Child Protective Services would have maybe stepped in and at least had a little interview or a little chit chat or something. Back then, it was just kind of a tough love thing. And when the times were awful, they were really shit and awful. But I remember most about Evelyn was her laugh and her smile. She was easy to laugh, which is such a juxtaposition. It's such a dichotomous memory to be able to have to unthread and untangle with all of the really nasty stuff that's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you had mentioned that it was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Would that happen like within one interaction that she would switch like that, or it would just be like from one time to another?
To be honest, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I was quite young, so a lot of the little nuances are lost on me just because of my age and my mental capacity.
Mm-hmm.
What was her relationship like with your dad?
Well, he could do no wrong, which I think in part was why she was sheltered from so much of the specifics of his addictions and shortcomings, as lightly as I can put that, because there was just nothing wrong that he could do. So, and to my knowledge, they always bailed him out. My grandparents always bailed him out, gave him a house, gave him money, made excuses for him, and defended him when he was completely indefensible.
Mm-hmm. Is this why you had to spend so much time with them when you were young? I mean, they were really intertwined with your father?
Well, they were, but I think mostly the reason why I did spend so much time was because I did like spending time with my grandparents. I mean, there are some real great perks. My grandmother canned and baked all the time. Her gardens were phenomenal. She taught me a lot about gardening. My first memory of scent, I think, are vine-ripe tomatoes in her greenhouse. I loved going in her greenhouse.
Oh, wow.
it made me feel like I was in a little secret garden of my own, right out of the book. So I did love being around them.
Mm-hmm.
Especially my grandfather. He tampened down the Jekyll and Hyde quite a bit. I was able to hide with him in another room, away from my grandmother when, it didn't feel safe or loving. And he always felt loving, always.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another part of why we were also there was because my mother at that point was basically a single mother, had moved back into her mother's place. And she still wanted us to have family and cousins and grandparents and maybe still try and prove herself as a good mother, because she was not portrayed to be a good mother because of her husband's addictions and lack of interest in his own family. So it must be the wife's problem. She must be the reason why he's slipping. So I was trying to keep up with the Joneses as well. And childcare. Shit, she was a single mom. Go to the grandparents' house. Go visit. Because there's nobody else to watch you while I work.
Yeah.
So when she was in a bad mood, like when you had to go to your grandpa for protection, what would be happening? What was she like?
She was loud and angry. Lots of stomping around. Just, you couldn't say anything. You couldn't look at something without it being sideways or the wrong way. But when a dog tucks his tail, if you're yelling because he got in the garbage, that look that a dog gets when its tail is tucked, it knows it's in shit. It knows that you are not a safe space for that dog to be around, and it goes and hides. It goes away. That's what we did.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we did, because you didn't want to risk being in the same room and she gets an idea where, she'll go off on a tangent about my mother. I remember this one. And it was to the tune of, she was insinuating that Mom was not being a good mother to us and that we were, impoverished and not getting fed and bathed. And we always got a bath over there. So I know that she thought that Mom wasn't doing a good job. We had to finish every single scrap on our plates that she filled, which was painful on a little kid's stomach because it's adult portions. But unless you wanted to be hit with a wooden spoon, your ass finished everything on that plate, whether your stomach could hold it or not. And pills. I remember like multivitamins. The big horse pills that adults take. And we had those as a kid. As a 4 and 5-year-old child, we were forced to take these pills because she, thought we were malnourished.
It's like, give me some Flintstone vitamins, lady.
Hell yeah. Give me the Flintstones. Yeah. He was a safe space. My grandfather, Frank, he was a beautiful, loving, caring man, which surprises me, reflecting on their relationship. I mean, she did have redeeming qualities. I am absolutely I remember those moments, those beautiful, soft, warm moments with her. But I don't know how he managed to retain that sense of warmth and happiness and optimism on life when he's married to such a tyrant. Something to aspire to, I must say. I gotta be more like Frank. I need to remember that more often.
Yeah. So can we talk about how the estrangement happened? Like, so you were spending a lot of time there and spending time in the greenhouse and, having a good time and sometimes not a great time. How did it get to the point where you didn't see them anymore? Did it taper off and it was just sort of more and more time in between, or was it a sudden kind of thing?
Well, I think following the divorce, it was far more abrupt. When my folks were separated or living apart, more effort was made on my mother's part to keep a sense of family, regardless of how well she was getting along with the other side for her children's sake. But after the divorce, it was pretty nasty. By then, my father was well into the deep hole that he had dug for himself. And my brother, he got old enough to be able to say, listen, I don't want to be here. And so as my little brother's protector, I would call Mom and we would go home. There was also a shunning from their side. It was insidious little stuff. Like at Christmas, all we would get would be a card in the mail. And Kyle's would have, my brother, his would have $20 in it. Mine would have 10. Why that is? Couldn't tell you. Was it because I was a female, the only female grandchild in the family? Whether it was because I was my mother's daughter? I don't know. So there was a sharp drop in the contact that we had with my paternal side of the family and the entire family, right? Because they were all behind their matriarch in viewpoint, in thinking processes, all of it.
Because you had talked in your form about her rewarding her favorite grandchildren in front of you guys. How did that present?
That presented with far more love shown to them, and overtly so. Far more hugs, far more kisses. I love you so much. And they were all the grandkids that were male. As I said, I was the only female. Those grandkids had parents that towed the line, who were never going to cross Evelyn. And their marriages were fine. All of their marriages were great. Nobody was in trouble. Nobody was an alcoholic. Nobody was a drug user. They did what Evelyn told them to do. And, no emotions were ever spoken about. But it was very obvious that Kyle and I were outcast. We'd have to sit at the dinner table longer than everybody else. We had to wait till everybody was finished, till we could leave the table. Stuff like that.
Yeah. And it's like she really just took things out on you and seemed to malign your mother a lot in your presence. And like kids are protective of their parents, of their caregivers, And so I wonder if she saw that in you and was kind of trying to break that spirit a little bit.
I absolutely believe that. Absolutely. Especially following my comment of standing up for myself and expressing my views about how terrible her son was treating my brother and I. And I attacked her as a 5-year-old little girl. I confronted her with her parenting style and that it was lacking because her golden boy was being a real tit. And I don't think that gave me any kind of good graces for the rest of my life with her. I think that was the nail in my own coffin. As a 5-year-old child, no less. Cruel, just cruel stuff.
Like, surely she knew that her son wasn't there for you, right? And like, do you think there was conversations when it was just the two of them about like him stepping up or... because how can you see kids not getting picked up or trying to reach out for their dad and him not being there? Like, I wonder if those conversations happened when you guys weren't around.
I highly doubt it. She was not the kind of person to talk about feelings. There was none of that. It was suck it up, smarten up, or else. And the fact that her other children kept the majority, the real bread and butter points of my father's addictions away from her. I don't even know that she knew that he really had a problem with drinking to the sense of, okay, well, he's being drug out of the bar every single night by my mother with 2 kids on her hips every night. And so I know that she didn't know anything about his cocaine and hard drug use at all, because they kept that away from her. They kept her out of it because Evelyn was not the woman to talk feelings with. That was not where you wanted to go with that.
Did the estrangement happen after your father's death?
Oh, far before. Far before. I probably would have been 1991 was the divorce, somewhere in there. And the estrangement was pretty quickly following that event.
Okay.
My father's suicide, it was in 96, I think. And by that time, we had already moved away from our tiny little farming town where everybody wears blinders. And they've, the kind of farming town where nobody's ever traveled anywhere except for the next farmer's field. It was that kind of place. So we had moved all the way clear across the country to New Brunswick from British Columbia the year my father committed suicide. And at that point, we hadn't spoken to him at all in 7 years, 6 years. I mean, I didn't know who he was with, where he was, if he was alive. I had no idea. But that was okay. That was all right. He had a different path, and And I wasn't meant to be sad about that because life happens and sometimes life isn't pretty. So,
Do you remember the last time you saw her?
I do. Yeah, we had gone back in 1998 for a visit. And it was the most awkward interaction. Oh, my Lord. Her and Frank stared at my brother and I. We were in a living room with my mother. And by this point, you know, we're in grade 7, 8. And there was no conversation. It was like they were trying to recognize their son in us. They were trying to see him in us and try and make a connection. But it was like they couldn't even find words to make small talk. It was a very awkward little meeting. They sat clear across the other side of the living room from us, and it felt like we were in two completely different solar systems.
Yeah, that would be awkward.
Well, it was more awkward because they couldn't even... I'm sure there was guilt there. I'm sure there was guilt for letting a part of their family go, and they don't know these two grandkids anymore. And these are grandkids of their boy, their golden boy. So I'm sure there was guilt. I'm sure it was hard to swallow that pride and that ownership of, you know, part of the reason why we were estranged. But they just couldn't put any words to anything. Emotions, small talk, or otherwise.
So you haven't had any contact with your grandparents or like your aunts and uncles on that side since?
I have. It was when we were living in New Brunswick. My Uncle Les and Auntie Tammy, they managed to get out from underneath Evelyn's thumb quite early on. They moved away. They were really exceptional people. And so their children, their two sons, were the youngest of the grandchildren. And the eldest one actually reached out and found me on Facebook. And it was really heartwarming to know that they still spoke about us, at least in some capacity, so that their children knew that we existed. And so my brother and I do have those two cousins on Facebook, and it's very rare that we ever speak. But he touched base twice. Once when Evelyn had a brain aneurysm and ended up dying, and when her funeral was. And then to let me know when Frank had died, my grandfather. The only other time that I've spoken with any of them was my Uncle Les, their father, on Facebook. And he said that there was some money in the inheritance for my brother and I from Evelyn's will, from Frank's will, I suppose. He was the last one to go. And I said to him straight up, I said, Les, I am shocked that I'm even considered family, let alone that Kyle and I are in the will. I said, you guys have completely kicked us to the curb our entire lives. It shocks me that we're even in there. And he said something to the effect of, well, will always be family. You're always going to be family to us, which I didn't buy a lick of it. As beautiful a man as he is, and I'm sure he does feel great pain to know that we are still outside of the family and that we don't have a relationship. But you were the adult, you know? Mm-hmm. You're still the adult.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm one now too. However, it was your guys' job to keep a relationship with the kids, with us.
Yeah.
So it felt cheap. It felt like a really cheap, obligatory thoughts and prayers kind of a comment.
Right.
So did you get the money?
I sure as shit did.
Yeah. I was like, oh, is she going to say we don't want it or something like that?
That's what I thought too.
No.
Oh, hell yeah. Yes, I spent that $2,000 right off quick. I sure did.
Good for you.
Nice. Good for you is right.
As cruel as she could be, she was a caring woman in her own way. And as poorly as I've arranged that sentence, it's the best way that I know how to describe her. You know, even her hair and her tight permed short curls, just was severe. Everything about her was severe. And then the mask cracked and she would laugh and joke around and bring you out to the garden. It was an absolute roller coaster, but it was filled with love, and she gave it in her own way, because that's the main feeling and emotion that I remember of her, that is tied to her for me. This, saying my story and my piece in turn is also coming full circle for me. I'm talking about it, I'm speaking about it. I'm letting that shit go by giving it a voice, and whatever residual is there, not that it's a lot at all, but Steph, when you had put out the call for these stories, less than pretty stories about grandparents, I really had to just check myself a little bit, because a lot of stuff came up and I went, holy shit, I went down the rabbit hole, and this was abusive and that was abusive, and Child Protective Services should have come in, and I really got fired up about it. And I thought, okay, no, we are not using the word abusive at all. I mean, I'm really going to try not to. But looking back as an adult, I'm going, I would never treat my worst enemy with that kind of cruelty, let alone slight disrespect. I just ignore you, which I guess in the end is what happened with us. But yeah, it was a bit of a trip to prepare for this, I gotta say, to get the right tone and really pick out all of the thoughts that I had and really how I wanted to go about this.
Because that's the thing, like a recurring theme, I guess, in season 1 was grandparents as a safe space, as a soft place to land. This kind of unconditional love that's unique from your parents. And so we didn't get any like evil, like, my grandpa was a Nazi kind of stories or anything. But like, we know there's like another side to this, that not everyone had great experiences. And we want to capture that as well, because even when the relationship's not great or when the stories aren't happy, they're still a part of us, right? And they're still a part of our histories and our families, and part of what makes us who we are. So thank you so much for sharing your little piece of that on the podcast. It's very brave, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a really healing process to dive back into these memories and to come to the immediate realization that regardless of the tyranny and the cruelty, my most poignant memories are happy. And that was such a healing thing to experience while going through this process. So thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really nice. I'm glad that, I'm sorry to hear that it was hard getting into it and going through all that stuff, but it sounds a bit like closure.
It feels like closure. And I didn't have to pay you my therapist rates. Well, thank you.
Yeah. I guess that's another service we provide, huh, Robin?
Yeah. There you go.
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories, or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.
And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really helps us out.